The LED wall stayed dark. The crowd didn't scream. Security froze. One camera locked in. That's when everyone knew WWE wasn't ready. In that silence, something heavier than sound settled over the arena, a feeling fans would later struggle to explain. It wasn't excitement or fear alone. It was recognition, the kind that hits the chest before the mind catches up. Thousands stood without standing, holding breaths they didn't realize they were holding because the moment felt personal. This was not a return announced in advance. This was not nostalgia served on cue. This was something remembered by the body before the brain could name it. The ring lights hummed softly, almost apologetically, as if they too sensed they were late. In the front rows, hands hovered above phones, unsure whether recording would break the spell. Veteran fans felt their throats tighten, recalling years they had buried beneath newer stars and rewritten narratives. Younger fans sensed history without knowing why. They looked around, reading faces older than theirs, realizing they were witnessing something unscheduled but inevitable. The silence stretched, and in that stretch, memories rushed in from every direction. Backstage, the mood cracked. Producers glanced at each other, scripts suddenly useless paper. A headset slipped from someone's hand and hit the concrete floor, loud enough to feel embarrassing in comparison to the quiet outside. No cue had been called. No music cued, yet the building had shifted. Wrestlers paused their warm-ups, staring at monitors that showed nothing changing, yet everything changing. The absence had become the presence, then movement, not fireworks, not sound, just a figure emerging where certainty usually lived. The camera refused to blink, holding steady as if instructed by instinct rather than direction. In that frame, the years collapsed. The past wasn't replaying. It was stepping forward. The crowd finally exhaled. Not as a roar, but as a collective surrender. People realized they weren't reacting to a surprise. They were responding to something unresolved. Social media would later call it unplanned. Analysts would argue whether it was genius or mistake. But in that first minute, none of that mattered. What mattered was the shared understanding that this moment hadn't been booked. It had been felt. And feelings, once awakened, do not wait for permission. Faces softened, eyes watered, and for a brief stretch, rivalries dissolved into collective memory. This was the rare instant where the product became human again, where storylines bowed to lived experience. Even those who had once cheered the loudest felt smaller, humbled by the reminder that wrestling, at its core, is about connection rather than control. The arena was no longer a venue. It was a witness, and every witness understood they would carry this silence home, replaying it in private, long after the lights returned and the night officially moved on. Long after the final bell, people would search for words, only to discover that some moments are meant to remain heavier than language itself. That night proved restraint can echo forever, opened not with celebration, but confusion. As the figure disappeared from the frame, the crowd buzzed in fractured tones, unsure whether to cheer or stay still. Backstage, tension thickened. Creative teams argued in whispers that felt louder than shouting. Someone asked who approved it. No one answered. Phones lit up with messages from executives who were suddenly aware they had lost control of the narrative. The return had happened outside the margins, and that scared people whose jobs depended on predictability.
Veteran wrestlers felt something different. They recognized the weight immediately, the way a locker room changes when an old shadow walks back in. Some smiled quietly, relieved. Others stiffened, reminded of opportunities lost, of careers redirected by timing and politics. A few younger talents asked questions they were afraid to finish, wondering what this meant for their own momentum. No one had answers yet, only feelings. Fans processed it in real time. Some cried openly, others argued with strangers, insisting the moment belonged to them more than anyone else. In the concourses, people hugged without introductions, bonded by a shared shock. The merchandise stands stood useless because no shirt could capture what had just happened. This wasn't a slogan. It was an interruption. Media desks scrambled. Headlines wrote themselves and deleted themselves again. Commentators searched for safe language, but safe language felt dishonest. This return carried implications that couldn't be trimmed into highlights. It reopened questions about legacy, about unfinished chapters, about whether closure is ever real in wrestling. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, trying to locate intention, but intention hid behind emotion. Families at home reacted to old supporters who had drifted away, texted each other, drawn back by a feeling they hadn't felt in years. Children asked parents why they looked sad and happy at the same time. Explanations failed. The return had crossed generations without asking permission. As the show continued, the ring felt different. Matches happened, moves landed, victories were earned, but everything existed in the afterglow of that silence. The building remembered. Performers felt watched by something older than the crowd. Whatever came next, everyone understood one truth. The night could not be reset. Something had shifted, and WWE would have to live with it. This was not chaos for chaos' sake. It was consequence arriving early. Those who thrived on control now faced vulnerability, and those who lived for moments felt vindicated. The return didn't answer questions. It multiplied them, stretching forward into weeks and years of speculation. In that sense, the silence was still working, still rewriting the atmosphere, reminding everyone that some moments refused to be contained. When people left the arena, they spoke softer, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. The walk to the parking lot felt reflective, like leaving a memorial rather than a show. Even skeptics admitted later that control had slipped, and in that slip, something honest finally showed itself. Wrestling felt less scripted and far more human. For once, exactly, the conversation shifted from shock to consequence. Backstage meetings grew longer, quieter, heavier. People spoke about respect, about history, about risks that had been avoided until now. The return forced comparisons nobody wanted, but everyone felt. Who carries the company now? Who once did? And whether the gap between those answers could ever truly close. The returned figure remained unseen, yet present everywhere. Hallways felt narrower. Posters on the walls seemed outdated. Wrestlers questioned their own narratives, wondering if their arcs had just been reframed by a single unscheduled appearance. Some felt inspired, reminded why they fell in love with wrestling in the first place. Others felt exposed, as if the mirror had been turned back on them without warning. Fans fueled the fire. Online spaces overflowed with stories, not arguments. People shared where they were when they felt it, who they were with, what memories rushed back. It became less about the person who returned and more about the parts of themselves fans rediscovered. Wrestling, for one night, had stopped selling futures and started confronting pasts. Family reactions added another layer. Loved ones who had lived through the highs and lows of the career felt the weight immediately. Pride, mixed with concern, relief, tangled with fear. They understood the cost of returns better than anyone. They knew that moments like this don't arrive without reopening wounds. Phone calls were made that night, not to celebrate, but to check in. Executives watched the storm build, realizing silence had power, but also responsibility. They could lean into it or smooth it over. Either choice carried risk. The return had shifted leverage in ways spreadsheets could not track. This was not a metric. It was momentum born from emotion. As days passed, the silence echoed louder. The absence of explanation became its own statement. Fans waited, wrestlers watched. Everyone understood that whatever came next would define whether this moment remained sacred or became just another angle. The company stood at a crossroads, facing a truth wrestling rarely admits. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones you didn't plan to tell. In locker rooms, old rivalries softened into nods of acknowledgement. People spoke about legacy not as a trophy, but as a burden passed down. Younger talent listened more than they talked, sensing that history had leaned back into the room. The return had not taken anyone's spot, yet it had claimed attention effortlessly, proving that presence cannot be manufactured. It must be earned, and once earned, it lingers. Media tried to label it a moment, but moments fade. This felt more like a reminder, tapping the industry on the shoulder, asking if it still remembered what connection felt like before optimization took over. The question hovered without answer, uncomfortable but necessary. Wrestling had been challenged by its own heartbeat, and there was no easy way to ignore that. Every decision from that point forward would carry this echo, whether acknowledged or not. Silence had changed everything. Permanently so, revealed the cost beneath the magic. As anticipation grew, pressure followed. Every rumor felt heavier than the last. Wrestlers measured their words carefully, aware that any statement could tilt the balance. The return had created expectation without instruction, and expectation is a demanding thing. It asks to be fed, and it rarely accepts substitutes. Fans split into quiet camps. Some wanted the mystery preserved forever, afraid that explanation would cheapen the feeling. Others demanded answers, believing that stories need direction to survive. Both sides were right, and that tension kept the conversation alive. Wrestling thrives in that space between knowing and hoping. Backstage, negotiations replaced nostalgia. The language shifted from memories to futures. People spoke about timing, about readiness, about whether the industry had grown enough to handle what it had just awakened. The returned figure remained patient, understanding that control now belonged to the moment, not the company. Family voices grew louder in private. They urged caution, reminding everyone that returns are not endings, but beginnings disguised as conclusions. They remembered injuries, absences, and sacrifices invisible to fans. Their concern grounded the excitement, adding gravity to what could have been reckless. Media cycles spun faster, then slowed. The lack of immediate payoff frustrated some, intrigued others. The silence continued to do its work, filtering out shallow reactions and rewarding those willing to wait. This was not content meant to be consumed quickly. It asked for reflection. When the next appearance finally came, it felt earned rather than owed. The reaction was louder, but different. The crowd knew now what the silence meant. It wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. The return had never been about surprise alone. It was about trust, about believing the audience could feel without being told. In that realization, WWE faced a mirror. The company saw what happens when it steps back and lets emotion lead. The question was no longer whether it worked, but whether they were brave enough to let it happen again. Trust is fragile in wrestling, built and broken nightly. This moment repaired something invisible, reminding fans they were partners, not just viewers. The silence had respected their intelligence, and in return, they offered patience. That exchange changed the atmosphere more than any chant ever could. Wrestlers backstage admitted it felt different performing afterward, as if the audience was listening harder. Moves landed with more meaning. Promos slowed, allowing space to breathe. The product softened without losing strength, discovering depth in restraint. The return had recalibrated expectations, not upward, but inward. It reminded everyone that wrestling is not just spectacle, but shared emotion. And shared emotion, once awakened, resists being rushed. Executives took notes quietly, aware they were learning rather than leading. The silence had taught them something no meeting ever had. It suggested that sometimes the most strategic move is restraint, allowing moments to breathe instead of forcing them to perform. That lesson lingered long after the noise returned, and it would not be easily forgotten by anyone ever. Reframed the moment entirely. With time, fans realized the return was never the point. The silence was, it exposed how hungry the audience had been for authenticity, for moments that trusted feeling over instruction. The viral clips captured images, but the real impact lived elsewhere, in the quiet reflections that followed. Wrestling moved on, as it always does, but not unchanged. Storylines adjusted subtly. Performers paced themselves differently. The memory of that dark lead wall became a reference point, a reminder that less can hold more. Fans spoke about it not as a surprise, but as an awakening. The returned figure eventually settled back into the rhythm of the company, but something remained untouchable. That first silence could not be repeated, and it didn't need to be. Its power came from being unrepeatable. In that way, it belonged to everyone who felt it, not to any storyline. Years later, people would still mention that night when asked why they stayed fans. Not because of what happened next, but because of what didn't happen. No music, no announcement, just recognition. The industry often chases moments. This one arrived on its own. The twist, understood only in hindsight, was simple. WWE had not failed to book the return. It had accidentally remembered how to listen. The silence forced everyone to slow down, to feel rather than consume. And in that pause, wrestling became what it always promised to be. Not just entertainment, a shared emotional language, one that doesn't need words, only space. and sometimes the courage to leave the lights off just a little longer. Fans who were there spoke about it with reverence, correcting details but agreeing on the feeling. They described goosebumps, stillness, and the sense that something private had happened in public. New fans listened, curious, sensing they had missed something important, yet still benefiting from its aftermath. The company learned quietly. Not every lesson became policy, but awareness shifted. And whenever the lights dimmed unexpectedly again, hearts paused, remembering that night. Not hoping for repetition, but appreciating that it once happened at all. Because some moments are not meant to be recreated. They are meant to remind us why we care. Wrestling continued, louder and brighter, but carrying a softer understanding beneath the spectacle. The silence had done its job, leaving meaning in its wake. And meaning, once felt, never truly fades. It simply waits to be remembered.